Yes, indeed, it does seem that you can get locked up for tweet. And we're then getting into the element of thought crime and pre-crimes. Whether it's described as political policing or two-tier policing, is that it is all part of an enormous corruption.
Welcome to the Astin-Gregory podcast, the show where we seek to understand how can we live free and prosper in this modern world. Following our conversation with Zuby last week, where we explored the rise of gender ideologies, today we're here to deal with another fascinating topic, which is the rise of political policing. The question is, can we really be arrested for a tweet? And sadly, it turns out that we can. So are we heading towards some form of online ministry of truth? Are we seeing an online police state arising? To address these issues and more, I'm delighted to be joined by Charles Malet, who's an ex-police detective who resigned from the UK police force back during COVID because he refused to enforce the policies that he was being asked to enact. These included lockdown restrictions and more. Charles has got some really distinct views on the state of policing as we are today, but is also able to look back over history at some of the legislation that has even led to this. So if you're interested about the idea of pre-crimes, thought crimes and online safety bills and the risks that they pose to our ability to speak freely online, then you're going to love this episode. Charles, it's great to have you on the show. We can now get locked up for a tweet, it seems. What's going on? Is this even legal? What's happening?
Interesting, in fact, that you would refer to 1984 and the tweet. And of course, I see exactly where you're going with it. And yes, indeed, it does seem that you can get locked up for a tweet. But actually, this has been a long time in the making. And very simply and slightly technically, perhaps, we only have to go a couple of years beyond 1984 to the Public Order Act 1986, where the elements of the sorts of things that are being criminalized in tweet form were effectively laid, the foundations were laid. The 4, 4A and 5 going through up to sort of harassment. The point there and the point now in articulating what you have about being arrested for a tweet concerns intent. So whether or not somebody's actually intending to cause harm by sending a message of some description, either face-to-face or via the internet. And then the sort of flip side of that, and somebody effectively suggesting that they are a victim of something, regardless of whether intent has been discerned or indeed is even necessary for the commissioning of the offence. So, yeah, we are in absolutely crazy territory. And I think for an awful lot of people, 2024 has seemed like a completely insane year. But when you do chart a path back through the legislation, and I dare say we could go back further than 1986, but that's a sort of convenient point, particularly because of its proximity to the date that we all have in mind, that being 1984. So, yeah, I mean, there are so many things that come from that period. But yes, I mean, to imagine that we could be arrested and more for sending a message to no one in particular is a very, very bad place to be in. But this has not happened by accident. Effectively, if you've been paying attention, this shouldn't really come as a surprise, which might sound like an odd thing to say, because obviously it is still enormously surprising to consider that a message that you might send to nobody in particular could see you being arrested and more. You know, this is alongside a trend in all sorts of, not just legislation, but this goes much further because this concerns the way in which the state views those people that fund it and empower it, i.e. us, but also the way in which we have come to view each other. I mean, by introducing the words harassment, alarm, and distress into legislation, and then of course there are other ridiculous words that frankly should never have entered the legislation or the statute, words like nuisance, for example, but they have, and of course that only seems to go one way. So the next thing that happens is people start considering that they should be policing their own environment, and this is why we get, you know, these sort of campaigns about well, I mean, whatever it is, but particularly in the workplace, people censoring. I mean, I know, censorship is going to be part of what we do talk about, and effectively that is what this is. But the effect that it has is to condition the individual against even thinking about saying a particular thing because they're not sure how somebody's going to react to it. And critically, it's the reaction that counts, which of course is not where we should be. It effectively causing harm should be a matter of either intent or recklessness, I would say, as far as the law's concerned. So if I want to cause you or anybody else harm, then that is obviously that is not a good thing to be doing. But if you perceive that harm has been caused when I didn't intend it, then for that to be leveled as a crime, that I've committed is entirely the wrong place to be. And this is why, as I start, I go back to 1986 when we talk about this sort of thing, because that is where this inversion is so clearly seen. And people now, like with all these things, it drifts and it creeps into people's consciousness. And that's where we are now with a society that largely considers, well, I mean, also I'm speaking very generally, but I mean, there's a huge number of people, particularly of a younger generation, who consider that in effect, being offended is, first of all, their sort of prerogative and their right. And okay, fair enough, people can be offended, but what is the consequence of that? And should the consequence of that be that you can level an accusation at who or whatever it is that's offended you? I would say absolutely not. And yet, going back to your original question about the tweet, that is exactly where we are, and it's bananas.
Well, what's fascinating about this is I've just spent a couple of hours with Zuby, and the last part of the discussion actually offline, which we did record, but we were talking about policing and in general, and how to deal with crime, and he was talking about the situation in San Francisco where it's basically legal to steal things these days. It was really interesting to talk about enforcement, but during the course of the conversation, we talked about this cultural subjectivity, which is really, I think, what drives a wedge. So firstly, it's fascinating to hear that this legislation goes back as far as 1986, which is really pre-digital. It's pre-social media, where this idea of a tweet leading to an arrest or incrimination is even a thing. But it's interesting. I think the idea where we talk about politics is downstream from culture. In a way, we've got this cultural sensitivity and victimhood, which means that now, yes, you can feel offended by something, but it is entirely subjective. And I kind of almost, what came to my head as you were describing it is in a childish kind of playful way, was I almost heard Cartman from South Park going, "Screw you guys, I hate you guys," which is clearly playful, right? But now, if there's a Cartman character in your school that says, "I hate you," they can take it literally and take offense. So it's almost like and how do you start to quantify harm when it comes to something that is deeply subjective? What is offensive to one person is a joke to another. So how do you qualify the harm on the receiving end, but also even down to intent when it comes to things like speech? How do you determine that the individual categorically intended to harm the other person? Physical acts of violence, someone breaks into my home and I use restraint to prevent further harm to my family, there's clear evidence of physical interaction on both sides. But determining hate when it comes to speech, and what comes to mind now is this, it's in popular discussion right now, is Alison Pearson's case. A writer of the Daily Telegraph, columnist. Police came to her home for a non-crime hate incident. I mean, they've even defined it as non-crime. How does this relate to what we're talking about here? Because for me, this is all wrapped up in this area where it's not necessarily restricted to free speech. It's actually a case of making sense of what is right and wrong.
It's very, very difficult. And actually, just to go back into intent, talking about even on the physical side of it, actually determining intent from a physical point of view is again tremendously difficult, because we're all different. And so exactly what somebody might intend by a particular action, whether it's physical or mental, is, entirely a subjective matter, particular to that individual. So trying to determine any of this is extremely tricky, not just from the point of view of, say, the police process of going through step by step with a suspect, because of course that's what's, once somebody's been accused of something or an allegation's been made, immediately they are a suspect regardless of the outcome. But trying to determine ad interview what somebody may or may not have intended is exceptionally difficult, even if you are to sort of suggest, which is more often than not unlikely, that they're actually going to give you an accurate version of events. And I say that, I don't mean that cynically, in that everyone who comes into a police station is a complete rotter, but actually what I mean is that people often don't really have a very clear recollection of what did happen, particularly when their blood's up, or when there's adrenaline coursing or whatever. And actually this is another, sorry, I'm drifting a bit, a point to make about the society we live in. And this, I think, goes back to what you're talking about with Zuby and the complete collapse of, I would say, way more than law and order. It's a collapse of society, it's a collapse of the family unit. But part of that has become people's ability to just manage their own existence and have a real grip on what's going on around them. And a very good way to illustrate that is by looking at the types of witness statements that people give to police. And sometimes you can cross-reference these either against witness statements of other witnesses, or if you happen to have CCTV footage of an incident, and you can see to what degree it tallies. And one thing which is sort of universal truth is that very, very rarely do any two statements match. Now, that's not necessarily because they've both got it wrong. They might just be in different places and have seen slightly different things. But what is really interesting is the level of detail that people are able to put in statements now in the 2020s compared with what they were able to put into them, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago, in effect before the advent of the mobile telephone and everything being given to your brain without it having to do any work is absolutely amazing. And I think this is a big part of all of this. I appreciate that's a bit of a sidetrack, but it's only a sidetrack in so far as it might not relate directly to the question, but I think it does obliquely, because let's say the Alison Pearson thing and the non-crime hate incident or whatever, it to get to this point has required a significant disengagement of critical thinking. I mean, otherwise, how else do you explain the suggestion of this getting through even the first meeting that it was put forward in? Immediately, people would say, "What are you talking about? We don't deal with those things. That's not our job. It serves no purpose, and it's, apart from anything else, it's intrusive." And we're then getting into the element of thought crime and pre-crime, because effectively that's what this is all about, is keeping a record. Any police interaction is recorded, and recorded in a variety of different ways. And I don't need to go into the details of it. Very sort of arcane system, and it'll depend on each force and constabulary as to exactly how they do record this. But the point of the recording thing is that the next time somebody is involved in an incident and such a thing comes up, then that might at some point become relevant. Now, is that right or not? If it's got to the point where it's in a court of law and you can demonstrate that somebody has a tendency towards behavior in a particular way, there are certain times that this might be introduced as evidence effectively of bad character, and it effectively can perhaps secure a conviction where none might have been possible previously. But actually the more significant point is that at the policing angle, the point is that if you're looking back through somebody's notes and you see recording of a non-crime hate incident, or even multiple, or whatever it is, that in some way, probably no small way, is going to influence the way in which you view that person, and therefore the way that you will run the course of that investigation. And the purpose of the investigation is to look at what's been presented to you in order that you're led either towards the suspect or away from them. Okay, if it's a tweet, you know who's done what, so it's effectively you're dealing with the technical elements of what's actually been said or done. But the point remains that this is to do with bias in the system. And this is part of a much, much bigger topic of bias, political bias. And this is something that's become more and more of a problem in policing in the 21st century, which is that the hierarchy is geared such that appointments above a certain rank, let's say superintendent, are political. And therefore, that will flow downhill, which means that by the time you've got to the sort of relationship between sergeant and constable, that what should be the traditional command and control function doesn't work, because people are acting or performing on the basis of political expedience rather than the nuts and bolts of their job as a police constable. And that's an entirely wrong place to be. So, sorry, we've covered quite a few things in that answer, but it's all of this stuff is relevant. And again, we to go back to the beginning, 1984, the 1986 thing, the sort of the popular culture breakdown of society, and the idea that children don't need their parents anymore, and this, that, and the other. I know I sound old, fuddy-duddy, and all the rest of it. Fine, but it absolutely it's the case, because why on earth do these things even need to be policed? I mean, they just don't. These things should be gripped at the family and community level well before they become regarded as even possibly criminal sanctions or interactions with law enforcement. It's beyond absurd. But this wouldn't be happening if we as a society were able to relate to each other and take better care of each other than we do. Of course, that's one side of it. The other side is police absolutely failing to draw the line and say, we're not dealing with that. Who cares? If someone said something stupid to you on Facebook or sent a mean tweet, turn your telephone off, close your computer. Honestly, it does not matter. But they don't do that.
That's the sort of thing I can imagine a parent saying to their teenage child. Don't worry about it. Like, it's just a tweet. But we now live in a world where it's not just a tweet anymore. It's actually, and I don't dismiss the fact that there is bullying that takes place in digital form. It quite clearly does. But in a way, that is also a reflection of our inability to handle ourselves digitally. I almost feel like the point of social evolution that we've reached in the physical realm, whereby I've repeatedly given the example, if there was an altercation in a pub between friends or between opposing drunks or whatever, there would be some intervention by other members of the pub. The landlord or the landlady would step in. Ultimately, someone would probably get thrown out. And there is that kind of manual resolution. Only if it gets to the point where there is genuine physical harm and violence may there be a call to the police. But on the digital space, you can quite freely engage in like really harmful, like hateful conversations and like ad hominem attacks, and no one steps in. There's no peacemaker in the depth of the comments. There's no rational individual saying, well, hang on a minute, calm down. Sometimes there might be, but often you have this like descent into highly polarized, tribalized discussion that is no longer grounded in a sense of humanity, in a shared sense of, well, let's have this as a peaceful, rational discussion. So therefore it creates this space whereby now, because there is that lack of adult relationship in the digital realm, you then get this police imposition, which it almost takes on that paternal parental role, which adults should be able to self-sustain, but they don't. To your point, they don't. We're incapable now of actually self-policing, and therefore now we get thought police and thought crimes.
I do agree with you. I think it's a very good point about how the digital space is dealt with, and I think, I couldn't say why exactly it is, except for it hasn't been around that long, so people haven't necessarily got used to how to use it. Although, of course, there is a generation of people who have grown up with it all the time, and I would say they absolutely haven't got used to it or know how to use it. You'd look at the people who fall foul of horrendous whether you call it bullying or sort of just the embarrassment of this. But I think that the point is that there's the, to use your analogy of a scuffle breaking out in a pub. You are absolutely right. And the thing is that with a digital interaction, in most cases, it's there forever. It's like that sort of drunken haymaker that does or doesn't connect is just happening perpetually because it's just there. And the other point, I think, is that in fact, I sort of use the pub metaphor as a way of explaining social media, particularly in the offence taken sort of domain, which is that if you consider, let's say, Twitter to be like a gigantic pub, but it's one in which people who should really just be having a quiet conversation one-on-one across a table, but actually they shout out to the entire pub what it is that they'd intended for one person to hear. So that's part of it. So an awful lot more people hear or read this stuff than they really should. And this is, I'm not saying that therefore people should be censored in how far they're able to send things. That seems to be the job of the chief executive of Twitter. But the other side of it, of course, is that people who are, just sort of leaning up against the bar, not involved in any particular conversation, can drift around the tables and decide, oh, no, I don't think I like the sound of that very much. I'll have you for that. So it's a sort of, it's a completely bizarre mismatch. And exactly like you say, people can't step in, and nor do people have the self-discipline to step out. I mean, you look at, I don't know if you've done it. I'm a big believer in reconciliation and dealing with people in a proper, respectful, grown-up way, and that if you do so, almost anything can be resolved if the other person will sort of take you at your word. And I've tried this a couple of times on Twitter because, of course, Twitter is a terribly polarizing place and people will spew stuff out. And so my philosophy was, right, well, this is fine. I will just go back respectfully and either, make a different point or whatever it is, but certainly not meet fire with fire and not try to encourage conflict. And it doesn't work. People can't help themselves. They want to drive themselves into some sort of abject fury. For what? I'm afraid I don't know. But the problem is it really, really does wind people up. And like you say, there's nobody to step in. And because people are largely doing this on mobile telephones, they're totally isolated. They have no idea what's going on around them. Whereas, to go back to the pub, if let's say this was a conversation that had started between two people in a pub that sort of started to get a bit out of hand, exactly like you say, other people would moderate it and step in. And okay, fine. You can't say for sure that therefore nothing would come of it. Quite clearly something could. But the point is that other people would be seeking to intervene and to take some sort of responsibility. And that's totally absent now. And so for that bizarre sort of societal trend to have had an impact on the way that the criminal justice system now operates it's hopeless and it's thoughtless. It is. So the excuse of, oh, well, it's sort of so new and we can't keep up, that I think that's no longer good enough, because it has been around well long enough for people to have got an idea as to, how to view it. And to think that anything, any criminal sanction could really come from what somebody types electronically to an audience that may or may not view it is farcical.
Before we continue, I want to let you know that in order to sustain this show, we're now partnering with brands that truly represent the values that we stand for, ultimately with the goal of helping you to discover products and services that can make a difference to the quality of your life, whilst helping us to grow the impact of our show. Have you noticed the financial world is shifting? Inflation is eating away at savings, banks are becoming harder to trust, and central bank digital currencies or CBDCs are looming on the horizon, threatening to erode financial autonomy as we know it. If you've been thinking about crypto as a way to protect your wealth, but feel overwhelmed, worried about scams, or confused by all the technology, then you're not alone. This is exactly why we created the Navigating Digital Assets course, a fully updated, beginner-friendly course designed to help you to securely navigate the world of crypto and digital assets with confidence. This course has already helped over 500 people to gain clarity on how crypto works, how to invest safely, and how to secure your assets in an ever-changing financial landscape. With holistic guidance, jargon-free explanations, and £197 worth of bonuses, this course will give you the tools and confidence to navigate this paradigm shift in finance. And as a follower of this show, you can get 40% off the regular price and enroll for just £29. But don't wait, this offer will end soon. Visit danastin-gregory.com/NDA today and take the first step toward protecting your wealth and securing your financial independence. You'll find the link below this content.
To think that anything that is simply typed onto a computer or a mobile telephone could in some way form part of a process by which the criminal justice system is invoked is completely farcical. And yet that's where we are. And we've talked about the elements of intent and, of course, recklessness to an extent. But now, the pendulum is swinging so far that we now have dedicated police, either units or individuals, actually scouring the internet or social media platforms in order to find comments that can be deemed supposedly harmful, or indeed not harmful, but worthy of some sort of investigation or words of advice. What an absolute waste of time. And we can sort of dismiss this to a point, but of course the real fallout from this is that this generates a huge amount of work, not just for the people that are actually dealing with it there and then, but to go through the process, the mundane process of actually starting what's called a crime report. So the moment that that there's an allegation made, you open up a crime report. It has to be populated, but this this does involve considerable admin. It involves letters being sent and victims and witnesses and all the rest of it, people being kept in touch with. Effectively, what I'm saying is this actually stops people from going out and doing their job. And then, of course, because the way that police operate is also terribly risk averse, to effectively close down a crime report and say, oh yeah, there's nothing to it, that's it, it's not going to go anywhere, the threshold hasn't been met. It, depending on who the sergeant is that would authorize that, can be a terribly difficult thing to do, because they don't want the comeback if such and such a thing then happens and escalates, and they have decided that there was nothing to it in the first instance. Of course, the comeback is perceived to be on them, which goes back to my point about command and control and the whole politicization of it, because there aren't people of stern enough character who actually know their job and will provide top cover in the way that they should to defend the individuals concerned. So this is although we might laugh about it and consider it to be absurd, which it is, it does actually point to a much more serious failing in the system.
Absolutely. Well, to me, it's an absolute, at the very least, it's an absolute catastrophic erosion of common sense. That to me is a fundamental piece of this. But I want to draw on the political element of this now, because another, we've spoken about Alison Pearson, but the last real headline around the policing in the UK was around this concept of political policing, or two-tier policing, in response to the Southport murders, where there was riots across the United Kingdom, and large accusations of two-tier policing, which to me would seem an example of political policing. Is that your interpretation? Did you yourself witness political policing during that phase?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all probably mean slightly different things when we use these terms, and I think that which is not to dismiss in any way what you're saying, and absolutely there was. I think the way that I look at it is that in actual fact, it's all, whichever way you describe it, it's just but one part of an enormous corruption, and a corruption in every respect, a corruption not just of the system, but a corruption of the narrative, a corruption of the explanation of all of this. My feeling on it, whether it's described as political policing or two-tier policing, is that it is all but one part of an enormous corruption, and I mean corruption in every sense. Corruption absolutely at the corporate level, at the state level, corruption of the narrative, corruption of the system, and corruption of the individual. So, for example, let's take the government's position on it, which was that they were going to evoke the full force of the law to come down on these rioters and these people who had told lies about, about Southport and everything else. Okay, so that's what they said. They then boasted that they'd made over 1,000 arrests, and so on and so on. So the bits they don't tell you are that in order for that to have happened, or at least for people to have been convicted and sent to prison, or indeed held on remand, they had to get rid of at least 1,000 prisoners in order to make space for those people. So, as I say, it was a complete corruption to suggest that they were making inroads, in effect, into the sort of the criminal fraternity. Obviously, you put that on top of the existing position, which is, first of all, that prisons are well overcrowded, but also that the criminal justice system, insofar as it sends people to prison, is statistically pointless, in that people who serve 12-month sentences or less are almost certain to reoffend. I mean, the re-imprisonment rate is, I think, about 56% versus about 33% of overall numbers going into prison. So, I mean, why on earth do you do it in the first place? But yes, to go back to the politicization and the sort of two-tier nature of it, yeah, I mean, it's absolutely beyond doubt. I mean, we can point to many instances where you look at something horrendous that has happened and has merited no police action whatsoever, no criticism or intervention from the state. And then we can look at other things which were, in effect, completely innocuous and did not meet the threshold, and yet were pushed through, and people were ended up in prison. And many a time was the phrase used that people were being imprisoned in order to be made an example of. And really, what is the example other than the system is completely corrupted? But unfortunately, so are all the people in it, because the political message or messaging, doesn't really matter what the issue is, whether it's Southport, whether it's anything else, is unfortunately recycled or indeed promoted in the first instance by the very willing and co-opted mainstream media. And of course, the majority of people working in the systems that enable all of this are digesting this content and believing it. So that it might look like two-tier or political policing to, say, you or I, but to those who are trapped within that system, it looks like it is the only right and just thing to be doing. And this, this is something I saw at firsthand, I suppose, in that some of the way that, I mean, okay, I was in Gloucestershire, which obviously is not, has a couple of larger towns, but is not a metropolitan area, and so therefore large gatherings of people were unusual. But the way in which gatherings were dealt with, depending on whether they were, say, pride marches compared with anti-restriction or anti-vaccine things, or something like that, was totally different. And yet the thrust of it is the same. I mean, people might take their clothes off or wear sort of weird and wonderful outfits on pride marches, but the point that they say that they're making is that things are not as they should be. And that's exactly the same point that people are making when they protest against lockdown or when they protest against the harms that vaccines are causing. So there shouldn't really be any difference in the way that such protests are handled. But because one theme or another is deemed as being progressive and aligned with government policy, that will absolutely directly affect the way in which it is policed. There are, luckily, a few sort of small-scale exceptions to that, but that is largely due to one or two individuals who are able to, in this day and age, effectively tread a more sensible line. But I mean, this is this is only going to become worse and worse, I think, because overall visibility of what should be the objectives of police are just receding into the dim distance, unfortunately, and to see that being corrected is at the moment unimaginable.
Well, I mean, I suppose before I move into that kind of conversation around how it's corrected, I'm curious about how we got here, because you've spoken obviously about the changes in 1986 that really created the space for this kind of subjective harm in many ways, but this deep politicization. I'm curious. I don't really understand the history of the relationship between the police and the state, but it does seem that increasingly, and COVID was a real example of that, and we will come on to talk about that because it's obviously a poignant part of your own story, but it seems that the relationship between the state and the police force has become ever increasingly close. Has that always been the case?
No, I don't think it has. Obviously, I can't speak with any great degree of authority, partly because I've only policed in one constabulary and also for a very short time. So I can't give any sort of first-hand qualification of that. But I think what is worth considering is how, when they were trying to force through the initial act in 1829, it took, I forget now, but I think it was 20-something attempts to get that bill over the line. So the resistance to a sort of formalized police force in the first instance was tremendous. And, isn't it interesting, nearly 200 years later, to see that all the concerns that then about state overreach, in effect, have absolutely come to pass. So, well, this is part of a bigger point, a wider point, which perhaps we'll get into, about sort of where we are as a society compared with where we were. But no, I think until relatively recently, I think the key part, the determining factor in police business, which should be operational independence, in that a chief officer of a police force or constabulary should have operational control of it. So there might be policing priorities that have, in effect, been disseminated from the Home Office, and it's up to the chief constable as to how they view that and whether they consider that that's appropriate for their area. But over time, what's happened is that those priorities and other sort of similar words have absolutely just come to dictate the way in which policing is done, and that again is something I saw absolutely at first hand. The very obvious example is the sort of campaign against what's called violence against women and girls. And this was most obviously seen in the wake of the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving Metropolitan Police constable. And that the very day after that was, I think it was the day after the conviction went through, the top objective, force operate. I think it was all called operational priority. The force operational priority was violence against women and girls. But I think there were 6 or 8 on the list, and prior to that moment, it hadn't actually been on the list, and yet it leapfrogged every single other thing. And then the next thing we were told was that the Police and Crime Commissioner had found £1 million sort of down the back of the sofa, and that was to be spent on dealing with violence against women and girls. But of course, there was absolutely no plan for it, and no consideration as to how it might be done or whether it was even achievable. And then you ask, if you ask somebody in the space who knew specifically about it and said, right, well, so where does most of this happen? And do you think it's manageable? The answer is, well, mostly it happens in the home. And so how do you deal with it? What are you going to do? Because it was particularly, like all these things, it's as though surveillance is the answer. You just get cameras there, cameras in the sorts of spaces where this kind of thing happens. So what, in people's homes? And so it just went to, it really demonstrated exactly how much the narrative driven both by the government and the media affects absolutely instantly police performance. Okay, in the event, I think that did just sort of quietly fade away, but only in that context. Of course, Yvette Cooper announced, I think, within the last couple of days, that she has a plan to halve violence against women and girls. Well, I mean, what does that mean? And why halve it? Why not stop it altogether? But the main point that drops out of it is how on earth do you do it, and why label it as effectively as a police responsibility? How do police stop that? How does it become a policing matter? Why is it not viewed from the other side, which is, well, why is violence occurring in society? Why is violence against women and or girls occurring in society? But of course, we're never allowed to question that. And this is, all part of the massive destabilization of society, that we've referred to a little bit earlier. And this very much goes back to where we started with the 1980s bit and well prior to that. But I would say the cultural influences that have really come home to roost now, and augmented very much by the constant march of technology into people's lives and taking away their sense of any kind of self-respect, self-discipline and responsibility.
Yeah, well, and that's exactly where my thoughts were going. And I was I was almost trying to plot in my mind, where the erosion of personal and social responsibility intersects with the rise of technology, and specifically digital technology, social media, etc. Because I think that is a catalyst. And I think the worrying trend with all of these things, Charles, is that in any case, it's another reason to give more power to government. It's another reason to give more power to the police. And to me, it's a march towards greater centralization of power, an amalgamation of the various forces from government to police, to security, to armies, etc. And I think that is a worrying trend that will only be bucked not only by resistance, but actually really reclaiming personal responsibility and societal responsibility, and in many ways unplugging from digital technologies and actually restoring community connections. Because I think that breakdown as a society, it's easy to point fingers at things like the media, and of course they've got their role to play, but we are recipients of the media. We are still sovereignly able to make our own decisions. But in the absence of, I think, a real strong cultural shift, which some would argue is beginning to happen in response to some of the things we've seen happen in the world in the last 5 years, I struggle to see how we reverse the course. And I do want to come back to this question of how do we reverse the course, specifically within policing, and what is some of the solutions you see. But before we get to that, COVID for me was a very strong inciting moment that things weren't right in the world. And I've spent it's radically altered the course of my life, and of course it's radically altered the course of your own life. You've changed career paths as a result, as have I. But you were in the police force during COVID, and it led you to resigning. And I've seen your letter, and it's and the communication between the police force, and fascinating. So firstly, I'd love you to share, in the context of what we've been discussing, actually, really, firstly, what was your first impression of the policing of the COVID chapter, if you will?
I think I just, this is much wider than police. I couldn't believe what was happening. I think I was totally caught off guard. I had, prior to this, when we got the signals in the end of 2019, I mean, it basically, it seemed to be, in terms of narrative, that the the whole Brexit thing was about to collapse, because that in effect was finished as a news story. So you could see that the mainstream was kind of casting around for something else. And lo and behold, there was people falling down the street in China, and I just thought, oh, here we go again, another sort of illness from the East, which will be roundly disregarded by everybody, because why do we get fussed about that? We haven't done in the past. That's that. I entered into conversations with people in early 2020 on the assumption that they would share my point of view, which was that this was just a puffed up news story and nothing more. And of course, it turned out that I was extremely incorrect, and it had absolutely gripped people. Of course, what I should prefix this with, I suppose, is that having not owned a television for 20 plus years, I was unaware of what people were being subjected to by way of propaganda and fear-mongering. So, hopefully, even if I had seen television, I wouldn't have reacted quite like that. But yeah, so I had a very different perspective right from the start. So I couldn't quite believe what I was seeing. What I should make clear is that actually my application process had started just before the balloon went up in 2020, and I wasn't policing during that year. So of course I saw with some degree of horror what had happened in various incidents that were captured on social media. But then again, my view of that was, well, you do always get, having served in the army before, I was well used to seeing small incidents that were blown out of proportion because one or two idiots have behaved, inappropriately, and it definitely doesn't characterize the whole organization. And so my feeling on policing was that actually people were largely still sane, and that it was a few individuals who had overstepped during 2020. I think it was probably more than a few in retrospect, but nonetheless, I certainly never saw at firsthand anything here to make me think that it was going to turn out badly. But of course, like everybody else, to wind the clock back to then, how long does it take to flatten a curve? I couldn't believe that it was going on as long as it was, and so it never occurred to me that this was still going to be a thing when I did actually join and start training. But people were still completely nuts about it. And I, to my mind, 2021, in some ways, in terms of social pressures, was worse than 2020, because in 2020, it was the sort of, we're all in it together. And this, that, and the other. Of course, 2021 was when the jab was rolled out initially just for older, vulnerable people, and then it was everybody, and then it was babies, and then so the pressure and the absolute nonsense that went with that pressure, of varying from sort of, take it and you can go on holiday. Take it and you won't die. Take it and you won't kill anyone. Take it and you'll actually feel loads better, even if you feel ill when you take it, and all these sorts of things. But so the pressures were extraordinary, and also so were the various protocols and practices with regard to who had, because of course still people were obsessed with the testing nonsense. People were this was not unique to police. People were forced into having to declare whether or not they had a jab, according to the ridiculous thing of, well, if you were sitting within such and such a distance of somebody for more than 5 minutes and you hadn't had the that, and the other. But I think the most pernicious part of it, as far as I recall, was that you could, again, I haven't sort of quite deliberately, I haven't really committed this stuff to memory because I'd really rather forget. But there was the thing where if you hadn't been jabbed, you had to take time off work if you were supposedly a contact with somebody that was stupid enough to have taken a test. And if you hadn't had a jab, you either remained at home for a particular period of time, or you came in and you took what they called a supervised test. So this was for somebody who had trained in order to be able to police the public and to be able to use your discernment and discretion in order to manage, frankly, any incident that came your way. But when it came to declaring yourself healthy, okay, obviously the whole thing's a scam anyway, but you, by virtue of the fact that you hadn't had a jab, you were deemed to be untrustworthy, and you had to take a supervised test if that's what you chose to do, or you just sat it out and you worked at home. But I that was one of many absolutely staggering things that happened.
It's time for a quick word from one of our partners. If you believe in the freedom to communicate, the right to privacy, and freedom from corporate surveillance, then you need to check out Proton. Many of you would have heard of Proton Mail. Proton is born out of the desire to create an internet that puts people before profits. Proton helps you to maintain control over your digital life, whether it's sending messages encrypted through Proton Mail, or browsing privately with Proton VPN, or securely storing your important documents with Proton Drive. Proton is the ultimate tool for safeguarding your digital freedom. Don't let your data be sold or your privacy be compromised. Go to danastin-gregory.com/Proton and start using Proton to protect your digital life today.
But of course, the thing is, the brainwashing was so utterly complete that people could not see at all that making this distinction between people who had and hadn't taken a jab was a problem. To everybody who had drunk the Kool-Aid, it seemed like it was the only reasonable course of action, and of course everyone was going to do it and talk about it incessantly. So it became, really sort of disturbing and dystopian, because there was no way of introducing the notion of considered debate. Yeah, I mean, it was a disturbing and dystopian time, because people, universally went along with it and didn't even consider that anybody wouldn't have done. But what was interesting is that in the earlier days, when the jab was being rolled out, the only two people I had an interaction with, sort of somewhat inadvertently, both times in a vehicle, and the reason for it was that it's ridiculous to consider it was a thing, but police were effectively being prioritized for the jab. So if at a clinic or a vaccination center there were slots available because people had cancelled, a call would come through on the radio and be right, two people, whatever, and so you could call back and say, yeah, we'll take those if you had slack time or you were finishing your shift or whatever it was. And the same thing happened to me twice, which was that the person I was in a vehicle with called in and said, yeah, we'll take those slots. And the moment they'd finished the call, I said straight away, well, as a matter of fact, I'm not going to take it. So I'm very happy to go with you if that's what you want to do. Anyway, the point of it is that, okay, we cancelled it and we didn't go. But they both these people tried to justify their position to me, as opposed to the other way around. At that point, there wasn't the enormous pressure on me as though I was a stark raving lunatic and wanted to kill everyone by not taking it. The first chap I spoke to, I said, but so, just as a matter of interest, do you habitually take the flu jab? And he said, no, I don't. So I said, well, why therefore are you going to take this? And he couldn't answer it. And he knew he couldn't answer it. And he admitted he couldn't answer it, but he went and did it anyway. And the other person I spoke to, I had a slightly different conversation, but he effectively came to me to justify it by saying that he was under intense pressure from his family, because they were all, unfortunately, brainwashed into thinking that it would stop people from getting ill or making other people ill, or whatever sort of ridiculous line they were selling at the time. But the point is that he made the effort to tell me why he was going to do it. I mean, obviously I didn't want any of these people to do it, but that clearly that changed. And by the end of the year, you were very much considered to be public enemy if you were known not to have taken it, even though those views were not actually held earlier on in 2021. So it's very interesting how how that shifted. And I'm afraid that, that's part of the bigger overall picture, which is that police just became so utterly skewed towards absolute loathing of people who had not taken this vaccine. And for me, what effectively the writing was on the wall, because the intrusions and invasions into the private lives of people had become absolutely intolerable. And you've obviously read the correspondence that I wrote, but we'd all seen what had been going on in particularly Australia and New Zealand, but Canada as well, and in Europe. And that was just horrific that police would get involved in such a thing in the first place, when we were told it was an issue concerning public health, which is not, that does not fall within the remit of police. And to go back to the operational independence question, which I'm sorry I didn't actually answer as fully as I should have done, but it was stated quite clearly in 2020 that it was an operational decision for police chiefs as to whether they would actually police restrictions at all, and if so, how. But of course, every single constabulary in the UK did police them in exactly the same way, which was to be very heavy-handed about it and to commit absolutely in full to doing it. And how would you be able to do that if you're constantly whinging about lack of resources, personnel and money? It doesn't make any sense. So of course, to go back to your earlier question about the proximity between, say, the Home Secretary and police chiefs, which is entirely wrong, that certainly was not always the case, but it's absolutely becoming closer and closer and closer. Even announced by Yvette Cooper in the last couple of weeks that, part of her police reform is to be closer to police chiefs. I mean, it's like she hasn't actually read her job description. So I digress slightly, but no, I mean, for me, it came to a head with what was called the sort of vaccine passport scheme, and it was a statutory instrument, which we can go into again if there's time, because we've talked a bit about legislation, and one of the most sort of abhorrent parts of all of this is the ease with which political diktats are spat out via secondary legislation. So statutory instrument, effectively you just need the primary bit of legislation which requires parliamentary time, and then off the back of that you can stick anything out. Parliament doesn't even have to see it. And one such was the statutory instrument concerning venue entry, which, so the example given was always football grounds and nightclubs, and who was permitted to enter and who was not permitted to enter. And as if simply putting it like that wasn't bad enough, which I do think it was, to suggest that anybody might actually be prohibited from going to such a place at all was just remarkable. But what made it so completely absurd was that there were effectively four categories of people in society. There were people who had taken an injection and therefore were eligible for what was called a vaccine passport. There were people who'd had a medical exemption and in effect declared that they would have taken it if it hadn't been for such and such a thing, but they got the vaccine passport on the strength of that. There were people who'd taken a placebo as part of a medical trial and had not therefore received the vaccination but had received the vaccine passport. And then the fourth group of person who simply had said no thanks. But of course, that last category who'd said no thanks were in exactly the same boat as the second and third, which had either had the medical exemption or taken part in the trial, in that they had not actually been jabbed. And yet they were the only ones that were excluded from this scheme by which they could enter premises. And of course, it fell to police to in effect enforce that, or at least it was going to. And for me, as I wrote in my letter to my chief constable, that was nothing short of apartheid. And he reacted very badly to that. They all reacted very badly to that, partly because they had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. And as I say, the brainwashing thing was just so utterly complete that they could not even see what I was talking about. And just to add to the absurdity of it, this particular statutory instrument about venue entry had exemptions. Like all these things, there are loopholes, there are exemptions, there are bits of sort of wordplay that mean that you can manipulate your way to wherever you want to go. And part of it with this was that people exempt included staff at venues. So if you subscribe to the infectious disease model, you could have somebody standing on the door of a nightclub or a football ground, ill with whatever your lurgy is, giving it to every single person as they come in, because they may not, in the sort of crafted narrative of, well, if you've taken the jab, you can't be ill, you can't make everything ill, all that stuff. So I mean, it was just it was completely and utterly ridiculous. But the very serious point that came out of it was that it was quite clearly being dictated by government that this is what police would do, which is entirely inappropriate. And also police were going to do it, which again was entirely inappropriate. And my question was, first of all, are we going to do it? Are we going to be told to do it from the chief constable level? And if we are, then how is it going to be explained? And also, where is the line in the sand? What happens next? At what point do you turn around and say, no, we're not going to do that? And the answer was, there is no line. Whatever we are asked to do, we will do. And that was absolutely more than enough for me. And of course, anyone facing such a fork in the path has to consider, well, if I stay, what can I do? Can I change the course of this dire policy, of this mad organization, or not? And unfortunately, and I had considered it, but I was not in a position to do anything about it from within, because not simply because I was, I was still at the bottom of the heap, effectively. Hope doesn't seem defeatist, but I had to recognise that by staying in the organisation, there wasn't anything that I could do about it, and that's not just because at that point I was detective constable and therefore effectively at the bottom end of the food chain. That was really nothing to do with it, because I was perfectly prepared, as I demonstrated by dealing directly with the chief constable, that I had no fear, for want of a better word, about talking or taking on anybody in the organisation. The point is that nobody was willing to commit to even understanding the problem, and that was a very depressing reality. I had a couple of conversations with one superintendent and one detective chief inspector who wanted to understand what I was on about, because they considered that I might have something to say that was worth listening to, but neither really could grasp the situation. And also, I'm afraid, like a lot of people in a lot of careers, they were too invested in it to really do anything about it. And so that was the reality, and it meant it meant leaving. And of course, what I didn't explain was the motivation for joining police in the first place. I mean, having had the conversation we have to date, but people watching or listening might be thinking, well, why the hell did you join the police in the first place? I mean, what were you expecting? And the answer to that is that I do like to have a positive outlook on the society that we want to have. And my vision for policing, particularly in a sort of detective capacity, was to really properly deal with the bad guys, drug traffickers, the human traffickers, those sorts of criminals that are not just sitting there sending tweets. And of course, that turned out not to be a reality, partly because the police is so skewed and corrupted, and does not, unfortunately, deal with the things that it should. And also that, with regard to what I was just talking about, the absurd sort of COVID policy was a complete mess. And so therefore I left, and I'm very glad I did, because I don't regret in one bit the path that I have chosen subsequently.
So with your observations, you've shared some really powerful observations about the state of policing right now. Before we I'm really curious to see where things are headed and how things can be improved. But have you had any conversations with people in the force now on any of these issues that we're talking about? What do ordinary police officers think about the last 5 years and where we're at? Do you have any sense of what other police officers feel about where we are now, perhaps in hindsight?
I'm afraid to say that I think the vast majority, and this applies beyond police, just want to put it behind them. I think, actually, oddly, going back to 2020, when police forces were largely restructured in order to deal with, what they were calling COVID, and had sort of COVID task force and all that, I think people were genuinely gripped by the sense that they were doing something and that they were making a difference. And I think that has sort of trumped any feelings in retrospect that they were doing things that they shouldn't have been doing. So I think people have absolutely expressed enormous cognitive dissonance with regard to this, and I think we've seen this across the board. The whole sort of mistakes were made line. So I don't see that police in general, or even specifically, are aware of the absolutely enormous damage on society that they took a great part in inflicting. So, which is a real stain. I mean, that's a proper indictment. As the conversations I've had with people who are still serving, I can't think I've really spoken to anyone who's sort of woken up, as it were. I think they've probably been made more aware of the failings of the organisations they work within, but then that's not the same thing. So I think people continue to be disenchanted, but that's largely due to the way that these things are managed, which of course is very much part of what we're talking about, but not the specifics of the way the system is sort of engineered against us.
I wonder in the same regard then if the police force themselves are even aware of the loss of trust with the police, because I think certainly those who were critical of lockdowns and COVID policies did have a breakdown of trust across all institutions, from the political system to the police system to media, but also from the wider kind of cultural ramifications that we began the conversation with this kind of war on free speech and this idea of online harms, which obviously leads into the online harms bill, which in itself is legitimizing this cultural slide. But as a result, I do think there has been a loss of trust in the police. So I suppose my closing question to you is, do you have any sense that there is an opportunity for reform within the police now? Is there any inclination that that's happening? We're seeing tides turning in other parts of the world with this respect. Do you see any trajectory for the positive moving out of this?
No, not well, at least not in the way that people might be imagining. I think that reform, insofar as it can be engineered by the state or the hierarchy, we've had endless reviews and reports conducted and damning indictments on this, that, and the other, but that is not going to change anything. The only way to change the performance of police is for individuals in their particular roles and in their consciousness to decide to change the culture from within, because there are, of course, by number, far more constables and sergeants than there are, what might be regarded as decision makers. And it is the ethos and the culture within the smaller teams that affects the way in which police forces actually work. And of course, those are the parts that interact with the public. And to go back to, what you were just talking about, by the sort of relationship with the public and trust, the thing is that police are very, very prone to regarding people effectively on the wrong side of the fence as just being them. And I'm afraid that, if police want respect, they need to respect absolutely sincerely the public that they deal with. And I can say at, first-hand experience that does work. It does not matter who you're dealing with, how long their list of previous convictions and arrests is. If you treat them with respect and you really mean it, you will get the best out of them. But if you go in there and you think that they're a wrong and that they are only going to get it wrong and lie to you or whatever it is, that's what they'll do. And that is absolutely the way that that policing has to be considered. I mean, there are many reasons why it's gone wrong, but I think it is absolutely possible to pull us up out of this sort of mire, but that's not going to come from a Home Office reform program. It absolutely won't. The political pressure and the media pressure on the people who are at sort of chief constable rank and immediately below it I don't see that as changing. What can absolutely change is the behavior of the people who interact with the public. And they need to be thinking more and more and more about that. And therefore, it is beholden on us as the public to treat police in the way that we would like to be treated by them. We must not put up those barriers and expect conflict where there might be none.
Yeah, I've got a much bigger closing question in the little time we've got left. We were talking, Zuby and I were talking about crime and law and order, and he gave the example of El Salvador, and I wasn't familiar with the case, but the changes in the kind of legal system and the political system and the policing system in El Salvador is taking it from being one of the most corrupt criminal countries in the world to now having one of the best safety, I suppose, low crime rates, but they've achieved it by basically imprisoning 1% of the civilians. They've clamped down on cartels, drug lords. They've just gone to town on taking down some of the worst criminals, and there's a real fear of consequence. And as someone who's kind of libertarian by nature and anti-authority to a large degree, that in some ways, even though I'm a law-abiding citizen and have a good sense of morality, would be concerned by that level of force. But I'm curious, are you familiar with that? But even if you're not, what, in your perspective, what would be necessary to create a sense of law and order if that is perceived to be lacking at present?
Absolute sort of minimalist state intervention in anything. I mean, I question fundamentally whether we require government, central government. I mean, this is where everything's gone wrong. It points to government. Okay, there are, of course, influences upon government, but essentially that's in this context where it all comes from. Now, I mean, I'm not familiar with the El Salvador situation, but it sounds very much like Rwanda, which on the surface looks very well controlled, but actually it's in effect it's kind of reign of terror, and I think that's completely the wrong way to go. I would say that we talked about trust. People need to be trusted. Sending people to prison suggests absolutely that you do not trust them, and therefore if you don't trust them, they're not going to trust you. So we have to get back to the start point for all this, which is the family unit and the community. And the police are hamstrung massively because centralization here, there's a sort of austerity era, the closure of police stations, the fact that people don't know police. I mean, I don't know, do you even know anyone who's in the police? But say 30, 40 years ago, you probably would, because you would have an interaction, you'd see them around. It's just not the case anymore.
I absolutely remember our community police officer when I was living in Torbay as a child, when I was at school.
Okay.
Actually, it wasn't just because he was the dad of one of my close friends, but he was in the local newspaper frequently. Everyone knew his name. Neil Stanlake. Great guy.
Well,
actually, really well respected and trusted. And actually, I think people actually wanted to earn his respect. It was really interesting, actually, having that level of connection to the police at that point. But it's so different now. I wouldn't, I wouldn't even see a police officer, let alone know who they are. If there is even such a thing as a community officer anymore. But I think that's true. That relationship between the local community and the police is an important one, but it's broken down significantly.
And this is not just applicable to policing and the criminal justice system. We're just, as a society, we need to interact more. That was what everybody craved, apparently, in 2020 when we were all shut into our homes. And yet, unfortunately, people haven't, in fact, turned that back around. But the more we interact with each other, the better things become. People are not isolated. And the same goes for police. If the police really are to be the public and the public are to be the police, then both parties have to mean it. So people, it's all very well being very critical of the police, but I don't think there are very many people who would want to do away with all policing in all its forms completely. And so therefore you just have to concentrate on what it is you do want and how you want to go about achieving that. And I mean, from an operational and sort of strategic point of view, to re-engineer and change the ways in which policing is done should absolutely happen. There should be smaller police stations opened up. People should be visible. And by visible, I don't mean just driving around in a car. I mean actually on foot, going to talk to people. That is how you do it. It's very, very basic. and everything has been sort of overcomplicated in the name of apparently, improving efficiency and simplifying things. It's simply not the case. There definitely are enough police. There definitely is enough money. There are enough resources. You can spend far less money and achieve far more by doing things simply. And there's a raft of academic literature to support this. Okay, obviously huge caveats attached to all of that, but simply a physical police presence in certain places at certain times of day for short periods of time, just to give the suggestion that they are there and that you can connect with them face to face on a personal basis. It does actually work. That said, those people that are doing that need to be the right people to do it, and they need to be considering that they actually want to work for the public rather than just standing there and telling the public what to do. And that there is a really, really sort of creeping ideology or at least ethos in policing, particularly among younger people who see it as a means by which they get to simply boss people around, tell them what to do, and as I say, just other them. They are them. And that absolutely has to change. But the way to change that is to talk to them. And again, there should be specific liaison between community and police. And again, that doesn't happen. I mean, I think that's something that happens to an extent in other countries. It doesn't happen here in the way that it should. So there are lots of ways to deal with it. But the point I think I'm making is that this needs to be tackled at the lowest levels, at the human level, rather than at the sort of strategic and political level, because those guys do not have a clue and they are the corruptors.
Thank you, Charles. This has been a riveting conversation. Unfortunately, we haven't actually landed on a massively optimistic note. but I think that, again, in the name of personal responsibility, actually, we take that back in our hands, because as you correctly identify, waiting for the police to outreach to us to rectify the trust is futile. So actually, in many ways, I think, I take it upon myself to identify the key individuals in my area and make contact, because I think it's important we have those relationships, and it's a restoration of the point that we've touched upon, and a thread that's been throughout this conversation is around personal and social responsibility. And if we wait for other people, politicians, police forces, or whatever institution to change, then you could be waiting for a long time. But we have the ability in any moment to actually influence our own reality and society around us when we begin to engage in ways that we've discussed today. So Charles, this has been fascinating. For those listening who are curious to learn more about your perspectives, we mentioned at the outset that you've got your own projects and you're a regular contributor to the UK column. Where is best for people to continue the journey to find out more about your work and what you're doing?
Well, I think primarily I would say UK column. So that's ukcolumn.org for the website. And of course, we do a news program on Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays, and I conduct plenty of interviews as well. So I think that is particularly on sort of justice and censorship and all that sort of thing. We like to be very hot on that. And otherwise, I run a Telegram channel, which is at t.me/Unbound Today. And I'm on Twitter, believe it or not, at Unbound Today. So I think those are the best places to look out for me.
Fantastic. We'll put those in the notes for you. And again, thank you for being with us today, Charles, and been a really fascinating conversation. And to everyone at home, let us know your thoughts in the comments. What's your observations on the state of the police? If you're watching from outside the UK, we'll be fascinated to hear your experiences, your relationship that you have with your police in your country. So wherever you are in the world right now, watching or listening to this, do reach into the comments and let us know your perception of the police and what can be done to build the trust that we've talked about, and how do we create a world where there is peace and law and order. So do let us know in the comments, and if there's other issues around this that you'd like us to talk about, then again, do let us know. Thanks again for watching the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast. If today's episode resonated with you, then please remember to subscribe to the show on your favorite platforms and leave a comment to help others to discover these important conversations. Remember, you can find our show on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and every major audio platform. And if you want to be part of the after show conversation and access even more exclusive content and behind the scenes insights, remember to join our supporter program at danastingregory.com/supporter. Your support helps us to bring bigger and bolder conversations to the show. Until next time, live free and prosper.